Hello everyone, welcome to the Inspire Online Book Club. Here we are again, and today we're accompanied by Clare B, Clare S, Anne and also Safiya, who is new to this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to be discussing a book called My Name is Why by Lemn Sissay. And this is the memoir of the early life of a young man who was a young Ethiopian man who was brought up entirely in care in this country. For the first 12 years, he was fostered by the Greenwood family, and then he moved to a series of residential placements, and each one seemed to get progressively worse than the one before. But somehow, Lemn not only survived these terrible early years, but he went on to become one of the best loved poets of our generation.
I think it's a vital part, because you just need to know anything about Lemn, having seen him on various documentaries and things, to know that poetry is his very essence. And I think it becomes clear throughout the book that poetry is what gets him through his childhood, and he's inspired by it and finds it a place of safety throughout his life. So I think it's quite fitting that the poetry forms part of the book, and it's not really separate. It all is joined together. They're very short little couplets, only about 4 short lines, but it conveys something. I think poetry does have that power to convey emotions in very few words, and convey something powerfully and shortly, and make it impactful. So I did find that the poetry really added to the book, and the fact that it's taken together and woven in, I found was very good. I enjoyed it.
I think they seemed to set up every chapter, didn't they, for that particular point in his life. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to say about poetry?
I would reiterate what Anne said, but also because it gave another layer to a book that was already combining various different forms. So there was, it was part memoir, but it was also kind of documentary. And so there were those documents that some of which you had to plough through from the social services and from educational establishments and so on, which were either quite dry or sometimes more colourful than one would imagine would come out of an official document, whereby people were imposing their own views on this poor little child. And so through reading those and then reading the memoir, I really enjoyed also having the poetry, which did kind of lift it and made it a much more full and complete work.
Yeah, I think that's
I'd like
true.
to say that I possibly had a different experience to the rest of the group. I don't know how you read the book, but I listened on audiobook, which I thought was absolutely fantastic because it's narrated by Lemn. So you know, his voice comes through in the narrative very clearly anyway, but then to hear his voice and his accent and the emotion in his voice, I thought that really added so much to it. But it did mean that I couldn't really linger over the poetry so much. And when I finished the memoir, I thought I wanted to get my hands on a copy of it in print so I could just go back, and they were the bits that I felt I needed more time to really unravel and reread again. So that's something that perhaps didn't quite have enough emphasis in the audiobook just because of the format. So I would love to go back and revisit those bits.
Yeah, I did exactly the same as you, Claire. I listened to it, but you don't. The little poems are there and then they're gone. And I downloaded the book this morning just so I could go through it again and remind myself. What about you, Safiya? Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I also listened to the audiobook, and like you said, I thought it was a fantastic way to listen to it. But the poems sort of slipped away a little bit, that you missed them slightly. So it would be nice to go back and reread the poems to see how they fit in within the story. But one of the things that I think I was aware of was, it's a book about identity. And one of the things that is constant within the book is he's constantly telling you a poem.
and that is very much something that is part of his identity. So, you know, he talks a lot about, you know, not being sure of who he is, but the one thing that's constant throughout the book is that he's a poet. His poems are always there. So yeah, I think that's always the constant.
Thank you.
I thought it was remarkable that he, you know, was able to call himself a poet from such a young age, you know, that like you say, Sophia, that he really identified with being a poet, and yeah, just to come to that at such a young age without any support or encouragement, it really does seem to be something that's innate to him, really. You know, it just...
Although I do think we're moving on slightly but I actually do think he did have support and encouragement from the schools he went to. When you read, obviously, when you read the book and the bits about the schools, and also there was a very interesting recent documentary about him and the memoir on BBC. And you actually even speak to some of the teachers and even the latest social worker, but it becomes clear, I think it says in the book, that, for example, in secondary school, one of the teachers gives him a poetry book, and they're actually, I think the school might have been one of the things, both primary school and secondary school, that helped him get through a traumatic childhood in care, because they did actually seem to be treating him well and going the extra mile. So and it's clear that in helping with identity in the secondary school, I think it said in the documentary rather than the book, that his teacher introduced him to Lyndon Kwesi Johnson and also Benjamin Zephaniah, and he really took to these poets and was quite inspired. So I think this shows you that the power of good teaching and getting to what children want can be really quite inspirational, rather than just necessarily following a set curriculum.
I did want to look a bit more at his school life in a while, but if we just start by looking at his early life, the first 12 years with the Greenwoods, there were good and bad aspects to this, but inexplicably they cast him off completely at the age of 12, and I find that very hard to understand, how they could have brought him up from a small child and then it have ended like that. So how do you think the relationship changed over those 12 years? Can you come to any conclusions about why you think they might have done that? Anybody want to start us off on that?
I mean, I think I spent some time listening to his Desert Island Disc as well, and he talks a little about the fact that he was the eldest. Once the Greenwoods had their own children, he was the eldest, so he was their first experience of dealing with an adolescence, of dealing with a teen. So they don't really know what to do with him almost. So, and to add that to the fact that he was a foster child, it's almost like they weaponized their religion against him in certain ways as well, and you know, taught him that he was evil or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's partly the fact that they had these other children who were quite young and they were good, supposedly, that it made it almost, I mean, I don't understand it, but it made it easier for them to sort of, like you say, cast him away a little bit. Yeah,
I wondered as they had more and more children whether it became more difficult for them to cope, because they ended up with 4 children, and they had a birth child not long after Lemn had joined the family, and then I think maybe 2 years after that a daughter, and then there was quite a gap, and then another daughter. And I wonder if the expansion of the household, coupled with Lemn getting older and becoming more challenging, that might have had something to do with it. It did seem extremely cruel.
It did, yeah.
I think also that just wondering about their motivations for adoption in the first place. I mean, they obviously, and that they wanted to, well, they wanted to adopt him, but actually part of the story is that his mother had never signed the adoption papers, which is really important and significant, and it's something that he obviously is really pleased to find out about. But so he's constantly fostered. So I don't know if that made them keep a little emotional rift in some way, to say he's not, we don't know for sure he's ours. But since he was a baby, he was months old when he went to them, so I can't imagine a situation where that's happened, where you bonded with this baby. It's in your family, you know. And I know adopted people, and I know people who have adopted, and the notion that they go, oh, actually it's a bit hard to deal with, here you are having back, is extraordinary. So I wonder what their motivation was, and if there was a religious motivation. There was a bit of a trend for adopting black children during the sort of 60s and 70s. Quite often vicars used to do it. Now, I don't know if this is actually factually correct, but I keep hearing about vicars' families where they've adopted one or two black children as well as having their own children. You know, and usually that's just takes place as a normal adoption, but perhaps they thought they were doing something extra specially good, and they were saving him. And there is this notion that, you know, he's somehow got to be super grateful that they've given him a home, and perhaps they always kept that at the back of their mind. And so rather than allowing him to behave like a normal child, like he was, they always felt he should be additionally grateful and additionally well behaved because they'd been so kind as to give him a home. And again, I'm sure that wasn't voiced with that, and perhaps not even vaguely conscious in their minds, but there did seem to be a difference between the way they treated him and their children. And that was something that was often picked up by social workers, who would make a comment saying, you know, the younger brother has to be careful because Lem's so popular and nice, and the second boy might feel mistreated, so everyone should be a bit meaner to Lem. You know, there were these extraordinary pieces of advice. So perhaps that backed up the family's ability to just keep a little chip of ice in their hearts towards him, which then inevitably they did act upon.
It is something that I know. Sorry, Claire, you carry on.
Just that I think that they wanted him to fit their mold, and you know, they didn't want him to know his true identity. You know, they didn't even, you know, acknowledge that he was black. You know, they had this whole idea of you know, when they encountered racism, of saying, you know, oh, we're colourblind, you know, rather than addressing what was, you know, awful racism. Yeah, and their sort of religious beliefs, it's like he was only, they wanted to make him fit a certain identity that was, you know, befitting to their family. And as he was growing up and, you know, becoming, you know, he was age 12, expressing himself a bit more, showing more interest in who he was, and they just found that problematic, really. I don't know what everyone else thinks.
One of the poems that I liked, I'm probably not quoting it properly, but I think this is one of the most impactful ones, is about the fact that they were a laburnum seed family where there's beauteous blooms and poisonous seeds. And I think that image is just really, I found that image very gripping. So on the surface, beautiful, harmonious family portraying to the social workers that this was wonderful, and then you've got the poisonous seeds underneath that outside people probably didn't see.
I think to begin with, even within the backdrop of their religion, they did love him. I think they did seem to love him, but they loved him while he conformed to what they wanted him to be. And the mother did take him to see, was it Harold Brown? So I think that was some kind of recognition that might be a good thing for him to see someone else that was the same colour as him.
And who was famous and admired as well, I suppose.
And Lenny Henry,
or was
Lenny
that
Henry
later?
as well. No, he saw Lenny Henry, and it was he went on stage and said it was his first time as being kind of like appreciating the laughter and kind of the performance.
But towards the end of the relationship with the Greenwoods, I think I could have kind of understood it a bit more if they'd have tried to keep a relationship with him. Can't deal with him for whatever reason, but we have had him for 12 years. We have built up a relationship. Let's at least keep an eye on him, find out how he's getting on, give a level of support. But it was just so cut like a knife, really. And any contact after that, it was Lemn that instigated that. Yeah.
And I was also thinking of the other children, because he says that he never saw his brothers and sisters, and he thought they were his brothers and sisters. He would have known them all his life because they were born afterwards. He never saw them again. So when he went round to the Greenwoods, they weren't there. And I just can't imagine that, you know, that suddenly you're thought, I don't know, to be a danger or a bad influence on these other children. And it does make me wonder whether or not, because obviously those children were also innocent in this, whether they did manage to meet up again when he was an adult and see. I don't know. That's never mentioned.
He doesn't mention it,
No.
and I would really love to know what their view was about this. Their older brother was taken away from them. I mean, that's terrible.
It must be traumatic.
And they must want to know what happened to him. So even if you were only 10 or 11, as the other oldest boy would have been, you think they might want to make contact. He does dedicate the book to that family as well, or he names the members of the family. So I wonder how they feel about that.
He's actually in. Sorry, go on.
He talks about as well being really close to his grandparents as well, his Scottish grandparents. I think he still talks about it. He loves Scotland and that sort of thing. So I think he mentions that he thinks that his parents, the Greenwoods, told them to stop contacting him because of his close relationship with his grandparents, which again, it makes you think, what were their opinions on it?
I don't understand.
I got the impression that it was the mother that ruled the roost, and there was an incident when, I mean, children were physically punished in those days. It wasn't just him. And he was taken into the best room because that's where it happened. And many of us might remember having a front room, which was for guests, and normal life would take place in the back room. And he was taken in there to be punished by his father. And his father asked him to yelp as if he was being beaten, because obviously the mother was going to hear that and believe that he'd been punished, but he didn't seem to actually really want to do it. So, yeah, I think the mother ran that whole relationship.
She was the dominant force. It was inevitably her rejection was the one that carried all the power and the weight, and the one that meant that it all went through. Because I think earlier on there was a social worker had suggested that the father was being very non-committal while the mother was talking about all these terrible things this child had done. And the father really wasn't engaging, and she got the social worker got the impression that it was the mother's wish. But obviously then that did prevail.
Yeah. So what about when he moved on and he went into residential accommodation? So there were 4 different places. He started off at Woodfields, and that must have been so that although the places seemed to get worse, particularly the last one, that must have been an awful moment, you know, to be moving from a family home to somewhere so completely alien like that. But what do you think? What helped him to survive that? He made friends.
He made some friends. I mean, again, school, he doesn't really talk about school as saving him at that point, but he does refer to teachers having, and that was the point at which he started being given poetry and so on, didn't he? And he still had the same social worker that he'd had from very early day, who did seem to give him a certain level of support, Norman.
And there's 2 different Normans.
There were 2 different Normans, not the one who gave him his name. No,
I think the first Norman was the first social worker who said, let's call him Norman, and that's how he ended up being called Norman. And then I think there was a female social worker while he was with the Greenwoods, and I read it that Norman, was it Mills? I can't remember. The second Norman, he started being his social worker when he moved into residential care, and he continued to be his social worker for the rest. I
think Norman was the social worker a bit before that, because he was the one who had actually prevented Lemn being moved for quite some time before, because he'd actually said to the Greenwoods, you can't just abandon a child like that. And he was Norman who actually is friends with Lemn now. They have a relationship now and consider each other as very good friends. He was also the one who gave him the first information about his mother and the first information about his name. He gave him his birth certificate, which is when he found out what his name really was. So
I think there are documents from other caseworkers, but not necessarily the main ones. So we do get that. It's quite confusing as to who's in charge at any one point. Other people go to interview the family and interview Lemn. So, but I think Norman was consistently, from before he actually left the Greenwoods until he turned 18 and stuck in a flat.
Yeah. Did he actually change schools? Because I do remember there being something about once he'd left the Greenwood family, should he really be continuing to go to the same school where his brother was? Yeah. And I think they made him change schools.
They did.
Yeah. They said it would be too upsetting for his brother. For his brother. That's right. The family wanted an absolutely clean break.
Yeah, that's very, very tough on him, because I think, as we've said, school, although there was some negative negative things about it as well, there was a lot of racism, and I think we've already referred to it, that it's in a sense they were kind of almost trying to train him for the fact that he was going to have a tough life. You know, so we can't have all this praise heaped on him, you know, whether it's warranted or not, because, you know, it's not going to carry on being like that. So there's almost like a justification for treating him badly and not, promoting all the good things that he did and how clever and likable and, all the positive things about him. It was all a bit tempered. So what about the second school? There were some teachers there who did help him. Was it the head that wasn't particularly kind to him? I know he talked a lot about it was more the unkindness of people, you know, the constant small acts of unkindness throughout his life.
Yes, the head teacher wasn't very supportive, I don't think, and I think is one of those people who had promoted the notion that, you know, life's going to be tough for him, so let's make it tough now. You know, one of those absolutely weird things. And also, nobody was ever called out on the racism. Like all the children at school who were being mean, he was told to just, you know, get used to it, essentially. And again, there was this prevailing notion that would happen. It was going to happen. It was inevitable. So just get used to it and suck it up. And yeah, I mean, I was at school, you know, during the 70s, and I'm just trying to imagine. I'm trying to remember, and there were people. If people were racist in our school at that time, they would be called to account on it. So because the leadership said, we don't treat people like this. Whereas obviously he went to a school where the leadership said, yes, well, life's tough, so get used to it.
That's just how it is.
Which again is amazing that he managed to come out without being, he's not embittered. He's sad and he's angry about some things, but he's not an embittered person. And that I think is one of the saving graces. I mean, because he just managed to find it in his personality and through his poetry to come out of it just balanced and compassionate and thoughtful about that, whereas he could have lingered on the negative, and I think many of us would have done.
Does anyone else? Sorry, Safiya.
I was going to say, I think also it's almost shows that he to a certain extent accepted it because they gave him the nickname Chalky White, which I don't know. I assume it's a Jim Davison, is it? Yeah,
Jim Davison used to had a character call that.
It's a racist nickname, but he kind of, in the same way that you're saying, he wasn't embittered about. He kind of accepted that it was racist, but also he recognised that in a way of just getting through, if he took on that nickname and just carried on, and then obviously later he sort of denounces the nickname, but it's like you say, he kind of remains himself to a certain extent and just accepts it and keeps on going, pushing through it. So yeah,
he quite liked having the nickname at the time, didn't he? Yeah. And was it his friend Libby, who was half Chinese, that gave him the nickname? So that probably helped him to accept it at the time. And then I suppose as he got older and saw the implications of it.
It was all about acceptance, wasn't it? It was accepting.
Yeah.
And so once you had a nickname and everyone laughed, it's like people accepting the position of being clown. You know, people will so accept it, but with an additional kind of racist overtone on it. But that was what he needed to accept to get by within that group of people, and so he just went along with it.
And it did seem that wherever he went, he was liked, but generally liked by his peers, whether it was from his early school life, his second school, the children that he mixed with in the various different homes. That, you know, he did seem to be kind of well received by them, and I think that's probably one of the things that helped him to blossom, because he was accepted by them.
Even as a baby, his you know, strangers, you know, stop to coo over him, and you know, he's very charismatic right from the start, isn't he?
He's just got such a lovely smile. If you see him smile, it makes you smile. Now, and it's like, he is the kind of person, and I think it comes through in the book, that you kind of want to meet and have a conversation with. It's like, you know, just from the book, you think, I'd really like to talk to him. I think you can have a good
seems very charismatic and
nice.
I did find the end of the story really quite mind-blowing, you know, where he ended up living, the name of the place where he ended up living, and, you know, some of the things that happened to him literally in the last couple of chapters, where he's kind of almost rescued by, what was it called? Blackening Care or something. I've got a note about it somewhere. Blackening Care. I can't quite remember how he was introduced to these different organisations.
Through this psychologist.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So there's I don't know if it's the psychiatrist or the school psychologist, but obviously, you know, recognises a great lot of potential in Lemn, and takes an interest in his case, and goes and does this research and puts him in touch with these organisations who she feels, you know, will really help him. And so there are these people along the way, such as, you know, the housing officer as well, who you know, really fights his corner even though he's too young to take on the tenancy. There are these sort of little glimmers, little pockets of kindness. But you know, it's still Lemn who's fought to get those opportunities. So you know, with you know, it's a very deliberate plan to get seen by the psychiatrist, and you know, he puts in a very lengthy plan to get these privileges so that he can do the gardening alone, so that he can run away and see, you know, the council's housing officer. So you know, he's really shows so much, you know, just determination, and he's got such a strong spirit, you know, to just not be defeated, to really, you know, really just fight and get out there and make those opportunities for himself, really.
I think it's quite amazing that somebody so young in their teens will actually be selling poetry. You know, that's really quite, I'd say, quite unheard of, really. And people buying poetry, which poetry is not necessarily the best selling. I love poetry, but it's not necessarily the best selling. You never see it on the bestseller list, do you? I exceedingly doubt whether many poets actually make a living solely from their poetry.
No, but didn't he have a window cleaning business as well? He was very enterprising from a very young age.
So I just think it's impressive that his poetry was so good from so young, and that people liked it, you know, from it just shows a prodigious talent, I think, right from the very beginning.
Yeah, so it was that point at which he got a job, and then the home found out he'd got a job, and he'd bought a guitar, hadn't he, from a second-hand shop, and they saw it and said, "How dare you? You clearly you've got too much money. We're going to cut your pocket money." And so that's the worst thing. So we'll talk about disincentivizing getting out there. So if you've got a job and you know, keep the hours and work well and get paid for it, you are going to be punished by having less pocket money to spend. And I think those kind of little petty injustices really got to him as well, and he fought against those. He was having to fight against so much.
I thought that was outrageous that they couldn't even provide for him in a financial way. There's, you know, several occasions where the authority complain, you know, that they've got to clothe him, you know, and his social worker writes to get a special grant or something to get him his clothes, you know, when he's setting up his new home, he hasn't got any relatives, any family in the whole of the UK, and the authority will not, you know, give him a small payment to buy pots and pans. It's just, you know, they you know, writing to his mother, there's a letter, you know, to say if there's any contribution she can make, and they're insisting that when he's suffering with his anxiety, etc., that he signs on, because he's got to contribute to his upkeep. And it just seems, you know, for a child, for them to not even want to provide financially for a child. You know, there were options available for him that they were looking into, where he could have a hostel or different accommodation, but it always comes down to the cost that's incurred. And so we're not going to do it. We're going to keep him here in a remand, you know, like a prison.
It was really a prison, wasn't it?
Yeah. Just absolutely outrageous that they couldn't even, you know, before we even get onto the sort of compassion and emotional side, even financially they begrudge him even just the financial support.
I think although there'd been failings in the other places where he lived, Wood End, which was the final one, I mean, I suppose we've all heard stories, haven't we, over the years about children that have been brought up in these terrible places and the awful things that had happened to them. But it really kind of brought that home, that this was the life that many children were subjected to. It was really terrible. So I think, going back to the poetry, I think there were a couple of lines that really struck me. And it was, "I am not defined by scars, but by the incredible ability to heal." And I think that really encapsulates this story, because, you know, he does try and rise above what's happened to him, and he succeeds. I mean, look what's happened to him since. He's done so well for himself with such an adverse set of circumstances. So, yeah, hats off, Lemn. Has anybody got any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you say, it's a very hopeful, very cheerful, in some ways, book. Obviously, there's the side of the authority, but I think, like we've said, he is always described as a cheerful, bright, intelligent, warm child from, you know, when he's a baby all the way through, to his adulthood. And I think it's because he's like you say, he's able to heal himself, he's able to lift himself up. There's a section where he talks about drugs and that kind of thing, and the paranoia that affects him, and there's a level of awareness that he has, that he feels like he's always getting lost in the paranoia, and he's able to sort of grapple his way out of it. He's able to lift himself up. So yeah, I think in that sense it's a massively hopeful book, and I mean, we're able to see where Lemn is today, and how I think now, again, I think Claire, you said, Claire B, talk about how he's not bitter about his life. He thanked his family. He's able to move on from it and grow from it. And I think, that's a really hopeful message.
Okay.
Yeah. Despite the subject of the book, it is wonderful to read, and very easy to read and quick to read and lyrical and beautiful. You know, it's not. It could have been very depressing, and it, as you say, the message that comes out is of, you know, inspiration, really.
Yeah, he could have dwelt. Sorry, Fiona. Before you,
sorry, I was just going to say it in the way that you know, people like Bob Marley inspired him. You know, I think he in turn is going to be an inspiration for those coming after him.
I agree, and in the writing itself, he doesn't dwell on. It could be a kind of pity memoir. He could actually really make us all cry constantly, but he doesn't paint the picture in a way that is sentimental or in a way that's tweaking your emotions. It makes you go away and think, God, he's talking about himself age 5, and I'm imagining a 5-year-old child having this stuff put on his head, and this amount of responsibility, and these prejudicial notions, and the reader has to go and work it out for themselves. He's not twisting the knife. He's not making our hearts ring for him. He's saying this is what happened, and it's got that energy and that vibrancy and that kind of general sense of resourcefulness that he has. Then afterwards we go, wow, that he did all that when this was happening to him. So I think it's a really cleverly targeted, very careful piece that nobody could read it and just dismiss it and go, oh, he's just whinging, or oh, he's just, you know, he never once there's no self-pity in it, and that's extraordinary. But then we should feel the pity of it, because horrendous things happen, but the writing doesn't make you do that. The writing lets you think, and then you come to your own emotional conclusions yourself.
I think he's praised from his social workers for being always truthful and honest, you know, and I think that this is a very truthful, honest memoir, and he's, you know, tried to make it balanced, and you've got the reports in there from the social worker and other professionals, and I suppose it's, you know, he's trying to get to the essence of what is the truth in a way.
I think that was one of the benefits of listening to the audiobook I found as well, that it felt like a conversation, because it was told by Lemn from his side, and then the character, I guess, of the authority was told in other voices. So you'd hear Lemn's account of a situation, or you'd hear from the authority, and then he'd respond to it and say, well, this isn't what happened, this is what I think happened. So it gave, like you said, Claire, it gave it a nice sort of balance, and it didn't feel overly sentimental as well.
Okay, thank you everyone. That's been a really interesting discussion. I knew this would be a good one. So just to let everyone know that next month we're going to be reading 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes, and this is a rewriting of the Trojan War, but from a female perspective. So that sounds like an interesting one to keep us going through September. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you again next month. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.